Psalm 62. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation. My fortress, I shall not be greatly shaken. How long will all of you attack a man to batter him? Like a leaning wall, a tottering fence, they only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress, I shall not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. See no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Once God has spoken, twice have I heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love. For you will render to a man according to his work.
Thank you, Isaac. I want to welcome you all here this morning, especially welcome our visitors. It's very encouraging to see you here this morning. As I was putting together the lesson, because we've been studying the Psalms for the last few weeks, I was reading an article about how it's necessary for preachers once in a while, if they don't do this, to put together a sermon aimed at themselves through what they're going through. And as I was reading through the Psalms, I came to Psalm 62 and decided this is probably a good psalm. If you've talked to me in the last few months and asked me how I'm doing, there's a good chance you've heard me say I'm waiting, because that's kind of where I've been. Waiting for news, waiting for information, waiting for this, waiting for that. Probably since about the end of last December, I feel like I've just been waiting. And so as I was reading through the Psalms, I came to Psalm 62 and verse 1, "For God alone my soul waits in silence, from him comes my salvation." And I thought I should probably do a lesson that I need to hear this morning. The last few weeks, we've been looking at life in the Psalms. And this series has been geared toward looking at the Psalms and seeing what the Psalms has to say about life, about our experiences, about why we experience the world the way that we do. And waiting is a part of being alive. There's no way around it. At some point in life, you will find yourself waiting. And it's really no surprise, because isn't that how life begins? You're in the womb waiting to be formed enough so that you can enter into this world. You begin life waiting. But waiting is very hard. And many of us don't know how to wait. You don't go to college and take a class that teaches you how to wait. And yet waiting is essential to life. It's inescapable. You will find yourself in a place where you're waiting, whether you're waiting for little things. Maybe you're waiting for the coffee to finish brewing in the morning. Maybe you're waiting for a package from Amazon. Maybe you're waiting to get your degrees. Maybe you're waiting to hear back from someone. You're waiting for information. Maybe you found yourself waiting at doctor's appointments, waiting for news. Sometimes it feels like we're waiting to die. Life is made up so much of waiting. And one of the problems of our society is we don't know how to wait. We don't know how to make sense of waiting. In fact, our way of making sense of waiting is distracting ourselves until the waiting is done, to try to speed it up a little bit. I want us to spend some time looking at this psalm and seeing how David waited. How he was going to wait. Because what he's waiting for is a big thing. There are some little things we wait for, like I said, waiting for a package from Amazon. There's certainly waiting, there's anticipation, it can be a little hard. But there are big things people have to wait for. They have to wait for, hearing the results from a doctor's appointment. That's a hard thing to wait for. And David is waiting in this psalm for God to administer justice, for God to bring salvation. That's a hard thing to wait for. So what David's talking about is not one of the easy things, it's one of the harder things. And I want us to look at this psalm and see how he waited, what he was waiting for, in order to help us to better understand waiting and what it means to wait and why we wait. And we're going to start really by asking the question, what is waiting and how does it affect us? Waiting is a hard thing to describe without using the word. If you want to ask, what is waiting? You usually want to say, well, you're waiting for something. But that doesn't help us if we don't know what waiting is. Waiting is really anticipating something that is going to happen. Something that is for sure. It's a future, you're anticipating a kind of future surety. And sometimes something is going to happen and you sometimes know the specifics and you sometimes don't. And waiting for either of those can be very difficult. Sometimes, like I said, you're waiting for news of some kind and you don't know what the news is going to be. That's a hard thing to wait for. You're waiting for something and you don't know what the answer is. But there are some people who wait for things and they know what they're waiting for, and it's still difficult. Someone, for example, who might be waiting to be executed. They know exactly what's going to happen. And that's still a hard thing to wait for. Waiting is really a place. And it's the place between where you are and where you'll be going. And you're in the present, but it doesn't quite feel like the present. It feels like if you were to take the present and just separate it a little bit, you're in the present waiting for this present to become this present. And it's hard. Waiting then is this anticipation of future sureties. But that's going to be our dictionary definition. That doesn't quite get into what's going on and how waiting affects us. Because waiting does affect us. It affects us mentally. It affects us physically. Waiting affects us. And it's really a time of distress. There's anxiety involved when you're waiting. Now, as I said, sometimes we're uncertain about what is going to happen, and that may contribute to our anxiety, but you're not always uncertain. It's a time of anxiety, a time when you're under a kind of distress and you're uncertain because when you're waiting, even if you know something that's coming, you're not totally positive. I imagine if I were waiting to be executed, like I said, one of the things I would also be waiting for, a small fraction, would be some kind of hope that it wouldn't happen. So even with something that's mostly certain, there's still an element of uncertainty. And uncertainty goes against so much of, especially who we are as Americans. We value certainty. Someone who's certain of their future is strong. They are wise. Someone who's stable in their circumstances, we consider that to be wise. But when you're put into a place where you're waiting and you're uncertain, everything is up in the air. There's a lot of anxiety and there's a lot of distress. And because of this, because there is anxiety and distress, waiting can be exhausting. It can take so much energy out of you. Things that are things that require mental energy affect you physically. For example, there's that passage right at the end of Ecclesiastes in chapter 12 that of much studying is wearisome to the flesh. It really is. Mental activity can be wearisome even to our physical bodies. And that's what waiting is. Waiting is a kind of mental activity. You're just waiting. And you don't know what's going to happen. Or maybe you do know what's going to happen, but you're still waiting. So waiting is the anticipation of something that is going to happen in the future, but that doesn't get to how it affects us. Because waiting can be times of distress. It can be mentally overwhelming. Waiting, I think, is exhausting because it forces us to live in a place that we're not used to living, which is moment by moment. We're used to being able to just kind of discard moments, like they're going out of style. Well, because they actually are. Have you ever driven to work or to school, and all of a sudden you get there and you realize, I don't remember the commute at all? We discard moments. We don't hold on to them. It'd be sort of like, Michael's not here, so someone's got to do the analogies. It would be sort of like if you're eating Chinese food. I mean, who eats the white rice when you get a bunch of Chinese food? And you go to town on all the good stuff, right? You discard the things you don't really need. You discard the plain white rice. But when you're waiting, it's as if someone just gave you a carton of white rice and said, eat this one grain at a time. And you're living moment by moment by moment. If you've ever watched documentaries or heard like true crime dramas, the people who have to wait for some kind of information about their loved one who's been missing, they say it's almost unbearable. They're just waiting. Because you are put into a place where you're living moment by moment by moment. And it used to be that weeks would fly by, semesters would fly by, suddenly it's spring, suddenly it's winter. And now you can hardly live 1 hour to the next. You're put into a place that is mentally and physically exhausting. So with all of this in mind, we now have to look at this psalm and realize this is the kind of waiting that David is doing. It's a difficult kind of waiting. It's a moment-to-moment waiting, physically, mentally exhausting kind of waiting. And I want you to notice this psalm. I've already put this up for you. This is something that struck me as I was reading this psalm. As I said, this is something I'm currently working through. This sermon, I hope will help you, but it has certainly been a part of something that I've needed to hear. To David, waiting was the solution, it wasn't the problem. And that is totally radical. That is totally backwards to how we think. To us, waiting is the problem. Waiting is something to get through, to move on to the next stage. But to David, waiting was the solution. In fact, David is not waiting because he has no other option. David has options. He's king. He has these people, you read in verses 3 and 4, how long will all of you attack a man to batter him, like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. You have these people who are lying to David, conspiring against David. They're usurping his authority. He's the king. He has the right to just dismiss someone, to execute someone if he wants. You remember Nabal. David was going to just execute this man. And David had options, and he chose to wait. Because to David, waiting is how the problem was solved. Waiting wasn't the problem. Waiting was how you addressed the problem. Like I said, he has enemies attacking him, lying to him, trying to take him down. They say, verse 4, they only plan to thrust him down from his high position. And David waited from God. He waited for God. That's a hard decision to make. And I think it's one that maybe we should really take to heart. That sometimes waiting is the answer. It's not the problem. In fact, waiting is how the problem can be solved. It's very different from how we think, but I think very enlightening for how David approached difficulties and troubles. So now we have to ask the question, why? Right? Why is waiting the solution? I think part of it is because during times of waiting for David, to him that was a time to draw near to God. Verses 1 and 2, for God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. Or look at verse 8. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts before him. God is a refuge for us. You know, in the eternal perspective, drawing near to God is going to be the best thing you can ever do. And David, I think, understands that that's why distress or suffering can play even a good role in our lives. I've said this many times, that our society is unable to understand suffering in any way. But if you understand it from an eternal perspective, and that even difficulties can help us to draw near to God, then those can be times of even great blessings. And David, during a time of waiting, drew near to God. And I think if we try to wait in any other way, it's only going to be a Band-Aid solution. Oftentimes, our solution to waiting is to distract ourselves so we don't wait any longer, or we speed up the process. And yet David took it as an opportunity to draw near to God. So why is waiting the solution? First of all, because during times of waiting, you can draw near to God. And you can do it in ways that you might not have been able to before, where all your distractions are taken away and you are just left in a period of time of drawing near to God. Another reason, I think, is because when you wait for God, you begin to see how much God cares for you. And that's something that's really important for us to know. How much God cares for you individually. He knows you by name. He can close his eyes and imagine your face. How much God cares for you can be seen in periods of waiting. Now, there's more than one way to wait. And like I said, I think our society, we don't know how to wait. In fact, for many of us, the most natural response to waiting is just to scream. I mean, we don't know what else to do. Just throw our heads back and scream as loudly as we can. And if that's true, I think it makes sense why a society that doesn't know how to wait is often filled with anger, filled with no compassion, filled with confusion. If you don't know how to wait, and yet waiting is such a big part of what it is to be alive, how do you make sense of it? How do you handle it? How do you deal with it? I think waiting is the solution. It's not the problem, but it's only the solution if you wait in this way. because there's more than one way to wait. Now let's start looking at how David waits. We're going to start doing practical applications here. How are we supposed to wait if we encounter this? First, we're going to look at verses 1 through 5 because these two verses are very, very similar. Verse 1, "For God alone my soul waits in silence, from him comes my salvation." And verse 5, "For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him." If you're in a position where you have to wait and you want to know how to do it, you have to first understand what you're waiting for or who you're waiting for. You're waiting for God. You're waiting for God. Which is a hard thing to wait for, isn't it? I think part of it's hard because, we live in a time where we don't see God. God's invisible. And waiting, we depend so much on two-way communication when it comes to waiting. We want to call people. We want responses. And you can't do that with God. You can't text God. Be like, "Yo, man, where you at?" You cannot get an answer from God in that sense. You have to wait. And that makes it so hard to wait for God. Because you don't have that immediate feedback, it's so hard to wait for God. And yet that is going to be the answer here. So you wait for God, and you wait for God alone, meaning you don't wait for anyone else. The problem with waiting when we wait for God is oftentimes if something faster comes along, we want to take that because we want to speed up the process. There are some things in here that can speed up the process. Look at, for example, in verse 10. "Put no trust in extortion, set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them." What is extortion and robbery but ways to speed up the process of getting rich and getting your way? David warns again, set not your heart on them. Oftentimes when we want to speed up the process, we try to go around God. And instead, I think we should wait for God alone. Because the things that it's not to say there's nothing that can accelerate the process that is good, but the things that often accelerate the process are immoral, can be wrong. So we wait for God, you wait for God alone, and you wait for God alone in silence. Now, this is totally radical from how people wait today. When we wait, as I said, we often want to distract ourselves from waiting. The most common way to wait today is to pull out your phone and wait. Be entertained while you're waiting. And David waited for God alone in silence. No distractions. Nothing to occupy his mind except the waiting in God. Some of you know I meet with a man who teaches at Choate, Rosemary Hall. And I was recently talking to him last week about my sermon this morning. He was asking me what I was doing. I was telling him I was putting together a sermon on waiting. And I mentioned this in particular, this waiting for God alone in silence, and how different this is from how we wait today. And he said that where he is, they have a cafeteria, and in the morning at breakfast, there is an omelet bar. And all the breakfast you can get right there, but the omelet bar takes about 15 minutes. And he said he's always wondered how many kids would stand at the omelet bar if they couldn't look at their phones. I think this is something we have very little experience in. Waiting for God alone in silence. Facing the waiting head on. Really confronting it. And it's exhausting and it's draining and it's hard. But that's how David did it. That's how the psalm starts. For God alone my soul waits in silence. No distractions. Nothing but he and God and waiting. So how do we wait? We wait for God. Got to know who you're waiting for. You wait for God alone. You don't use immoral things to speed up the process to go around God. And you wait for God alone in silence. And you just spend time waiting. Because that's the place where God wants us. Sometimes God wants us there and no place else. And that's a hard thing to deal with. And lastly, you wait for God in prayer. So in verse 8, David says, pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. If you don't spend time in prayer while waiting, it will be close to, if not totally, unbearable. This is something I've had to really work through and learn. I've had to learn how to stop distracting myself all the time and to just spend times waiting in silence and in prayer with God. That's a hard thing to do. And it is not natural to us. It doesn't come naturally to us. But it's something we work in, we grow in. So they're actions that we take. They become new tools for us as we grow up later in life. God supplies strength, and the way God often supplies strength is through prayer. So if you want to spend time in prayer and you don't know if you can do it, just trust for a moment that God can actually equip you to be someone who can do it. That's what Peter teaches us in 1 Peter. That God supplies strength. And the way God often supplies strength is through prayer. In fact, if you're waiting and you're praying, you're probably at your strongest while you're waiting. This is how Jesus waited too. Jesus spent a lot of time waiting. The night before he appointed the 12, he spent time in prayer with God, waiting to appoint these men who are going to oversee his church. If you were here a couple of years ago, Tom Rainwater spoke about Jesus' suffering and waiting in the garden and spending time in prayer waiting. That's how Jesus waited. That's how David waited. And I think that's how we need to wait. Waiting is an inescapable part of life. As I said, you begin life waiting. To be formed in the womb, to come out, and to be able to handle at least the physical aspects of this world. You're going to spend time waiting in traffic. You're going to spend time waiting in line. You're going to spend time waiting for news, waiting for answers. You're going to spend a lot of time in this world waiting. And if you don't know how to wait, it will destroy you. It will crush you. Because waiting is exhausting. It's demanding, physically and mentally. And David here, I think, in Psalm 62, gives us a good example of how to wait. This is how he waited. He was waiting for justice from God. And his example is you wait for God. You don't wait for anyone else. You wait for God in silence. You wait for God in prayer. because from God comes your hope. From God comes your salvation. Are you waiting this morning? Are you in a period where it seems like you are never going to get to where you should be going? Does it just feel like you're always waiting? The only way to handle this is to look to God. To look to Him, to pray to Him, to spend time with Him. It's not to say you never look at your phone. It's not to say you never watch a movie. But it is to say that distracting ourselves is not the same as facing the waiting head on. If you need prayers this morning, please talk to us. We would love to pray with you and to pray for you. If you have questions, please, again, talk to us. There are many people here who have studied, who can answer your questions. If you have questions about God, about the church, about Jesus at all, if there's anything that we can do for you, we ask that you would talk to us or even make your need known now as we stand and sing the invitation song.